am a member of the United States House of Representatives, which has how many people? How many people in the House? How many people in the House? Good job. How many in the Senate? That one's easy, right? So we have 435 members of the House of Representatives that get to vote. We also have a handful of people from the various territories that America controls, ranging from Puerto Rico to U.S. Guam to the Mauritian Islands. So there's several of them as well, which don't vote as part of the 435, but sort of hang around with us. They get to sponsor bills, they get to go to committees, and they get to vote in committee. So we have a number of them as well. It turns out each congressional district is about 750,000 people in size. They range from 700 to 800 roughly. It's apportioned every 10 years after the census so that they're balanced out and are roughly the same size. Does anybody know how many Colorado has in the United States Congress? How many members of the House?
Is it 8?
Very close. We have 7 members of the House from Colorado. Hopefully, in the year 2020, we'll be big enough to garner an 8th member as a result of that census. As you know, a law needs to pass the House of Representatives and the Senate and be signed by the President to pass. Now, it sounds like some of you might not be taking comparative government, but when you look at how many other democracies around the world function, in Europe, in Japan, and other countries, most of those countries have a prime minister and one chamber. And so it is much easier for laws to pass because they don't have a separate executive and they don't have a second chamber, or if they do, the second chamber is very limited in their power. So generally a law would be passed by Parliament and become law and be implemented by the head of that Parliament, the Prime Minister. What we have in our country is a division of powers. It means that it is a lot harder to pass laws. It's a lot harder to pass good laws. It's a lot harder to pass bad laws. And the Founding Fathers set it up that way to ensure that we had adequate discussion and room for debate, a balance between the powers of the states, which are fundamentally represented in the Senate, where a state like North Dakota has the same representation as a state like California, and the people, which are represented in the House of Representatives. No matter where you live, you have one for roughly 700 to 800,000 people in the country. So that is why you often hear that things are not passing, things are paralyzed. Why isn't Congress doing anything? The House passed this, the Senate didn't take it up, the Senate passed this, the House didn't take it up. And of course, ultimately, the President needs to buy in and sign whatever law emerges from both, unless, of course, a veto is overturned, which is very, very rare, of course, requiring 2/3 majorities in both the House and the Senate. And in my time in the House, I'm trying to think, I don't think we've voted on a single veto override. It just shows how rare they are. There hasn't been a single attempt to override a presidential veto, because I don't think there's been any that I can recall. There might have been one, but I think it was because it was something that was settled before it reached his desk, and I don't think we voted on overturning it. So they're very rare. Usually, if 2/3 of Congress or close to it support something, I mean, it'd be something that's so overwhelmingly popular, usually the President isn't going to stand in the way of that. So that is a nutshell the process, what our life is like, and we have kind of 3 jobs that we do. One is the job of the legislator in Washington, and that job is we're working on bills, we're in committee, we're hearing from stakeholders, we're assembling coalitions, we're convincing our colleagues. That's the work that we do there. Whatever the topic is we're working on, that's the work we do there as a legislator. Here at home, we are the community leader and bringing people together in the community, listeners in the community, the title of the job, representative. So yesterday, for instance, in Loveland, we had a session on balancing the budget. We had 80 or 90 Loveland residents come together, and we help from some outside groups that are focused on reducing the deficit, and we challenge them to try to balance the budget in small groups, and that work informs my work in terms of supporting spending cuts to balance the budget. So we do those kinds of things, listen to different constituent groups, meeting with farmers or listening to you. Part of what we're going to do today is hear what your ideas and what you would like Congress to do, and that is the second part of the job. The third part of the job is the political part, and that means we actually have to run for office, it turns out. We're not appointed for life. And that occurs in the House of Representatives every 2 years and the Senate every 6 years. and that involves candidates raising a lot of money, going to political rallies where they go rah-rah, getting nominated by their parties unless they happen to be an independent, and winning elections. So those are the three things that we do, and our time is divided. So you're in Washington as a legislator, but you do a little bit of listening to constituents there, because guess what? Some of them fly out and listen to you, or you might call them and hear what's on their mind. You also take a few hours a day and you go to a phone bank and you raise money for a few hours. And then when you're here, you're mostly doing kind of official work where you're listening and talking to constituents, but again, you might go to a political rally or raise money for a couple hours a day. And then you might have to weigh in on some bills remotely, like I'll call the DC, we're working on this bill, I might go over a draft of it before we introduce it, or I might have to call a colleague or two to say, when we get back, we're going to be working on a certain bill. And so you might do a little bit of that legislative job while you're here as well. So those are really the three components to the job that we have. It's a very demanding job. Obviously we commute to Washington most weeks. All three aspects of the job could be full-time jobs in their own right. It would be very easy to spend full-time listening to people in the community. It would be very easy to spend full-time as a legislator. It would be very easy to spend full-time running for office, as many people do who are not incumbents when they're running. They actually have to do this full-time for sometimes a year before they even get the opportunity to serve. So that is a little bit of a nutshell about what life is like. Questions about kind of what life is like or what we actually do? Would be happy to hear any of those that you have. Yes?
I was just going to ask, how did you get started before you got elected? Like, how did you raise awareness to your platform and get elected?
Well, I served with your principal on the State Board of Education, and he failed to convince me not to run for Congress. I really enjoyed being active in education. So I actually founded a couple charter schools in the Denver metro area, and now they're in New Mexico as well, and they're opening in Nevada soon. And I'd been on the State Board of Education for 6 years. So that was kind of what I had done before. My day job during that time was being in business, and I founded several internet and technology related companies in the 90s and 2000s. And part of the decision to run for office comes first, is there an opportunity to run for office? And so generally, if you're of the same party as the incumbent, unless they make some major mistake, you're not going to challenge them in a primary because it's very difficult to do. Now it does happen, and Congressman Doug Lamborn is being challenged in a primary, not for any clear reason that he did something wrong, but just because maybe he failed to assemble the community coalition behind him like one should. And certainly if I failed to do that local piece of the outreach, certainly if you only do one of those three jobs, you could certainly be challenged by your own party. Like if you only do the job as legislator, and you stay in DC and you legislate all day, even if you're the best darn legislator in the world, you can have a primary against you. We actually have an instance of this. There was because of redistricting, there tend to be primaries because several Congress people are put together in the same district sometime. There was one district in California where two Congressmen, Howard Berman and Brad Sherman, their names sound almost the same. Howard Berman and Brad Sherman were put together in a district. They were they're both liberal Jewish Democrats that have, I think, no difference on any issue that one could possibly see. Howard Berman, as Bob knows, as Principal Schaefer knows, is an accomplished, respected legislator that I think had everybody liked from both parties, had a lot of bills passed, was the chair of the Foreign Relations Committee, was doing high-level diplomacy on behalf of our country, working with Democratic and Republican presidents all over the world, had very little profile back home. His opponent, Brad Sherman, did very little legislating. I would never talk ill of a colleague, but off the record, well, we're on camera, so we can't. But he's a fine man. He's a fine. What is this going? Where's this going?
This goes on our school YouTube channel. Parents are going to watch it.
Oh well, no. Brad Sherman is a good guy, but he was not the chair of the committee. He was not the one that was globe-trotting and doing that. But he did a very, very good job back home. He went to every bar mitzvah, funeral, was always seen. And this is in the LA area, back home. So one had the legislative profile, one had the district involvement profile. And they're both Democrats, and the district's all Democrats, and that wasn't an issue what their positions were. So they had to run against one another because they were put in the same district. And the one who won was the one who was known back home and did that work. The one that had been the legislator didn't win because they didn't know him as well. He hadn't been to the funerals and the bar mitzvahs. He was busy meeting with heads of state around the world. So that's kind of an example of how the different profiles are, can be mutually exclusive, and why it's so important for a member of Congress to work on all three if they're going to be effective. And frankly, again, if you were a totally ineffective legislator, even if you did everything good back home, you could also come under fire. That potentially could be one of the issues in the Doug Lamborn primary. They might say, well, he seems like a nice guy, we like him here. Is he the most effective voice for us? I think that's what the Republicans in this case, this is a district that is overwhelmingly Republican, will be discussing as they decide who they want their Republican member of Congress to be. So you really have to focus on all three jobs, and you don't want to do one so well that it comes at the expense of another entirely, or you're not being effective as a member of Congress. Likewise, you have to do the political piece. Again, frankly, if you're a great legislator and you're still going to funerals and bar mitzvahs and talking to classes and listening, if you don't raise any money and run a campaign, guess what? You could still lose, and you probably will. No matter how much outreach you do, and no matter how great you are as a legislator, you still have the political piece of raising the money, running a campaign, doing all that piece. So you really have to be able to do all three to be able to succeed in this position and represent the people. What other questions? Jamie, you have a question.
Can I ask the kids a question?
We'll
About
ask.
redistricting? Do you guys know what district your principal represented? What number? Did you guys know your principal was a congressman?
Yes.
So he represented District 4. And do you guys know what district Jared represents?
2, yeah.
2. But they both represented Fort Collins. How did that work?
Right, so read it except every 10 years. And so, so for instance, the city of Thornton, I represented, and now a fellow by the name of Ed Perlmutter represented. So every 10 years, they change. They change more in years where the number of seats change. Colorado went from 6 to 7. It might go from 7 to 8. And because of that, everything has to be reconfigured and redrawn. But that is why you might have several members of Congress that every redistricting could even live in the same district and run against one another. Or you can have former members of Congress that live in an area that are now represented by somebody who had been representing a different district. Other questions about what we do? Yeah.
How much time do you actually spend in Washington, D.C.?
We are in D.C. most weeks during the week. We're not there this week because we get to be here, which is wonderful. But we are in session roughly 3 out of every 4 weeks. And so that doesn't mean it's necessarily the entire week. It might be Monday through Thursday, or it might be Tuesday through Friday. Usually it's 4 days. On occasions it's 5 days, on occasions it's 3 days. Keep in mind that it's a commuting day. If we start on Monday, we don't start till 6:30 p.m. because we have to get there. Not just us, but Californians and Texans and everybody else. And that kind of takes the better part of a day. So we're there about 3/4 of the time, roughly. And then there's occasionally we're not in session. The only month we're not in session is August, so it's wonderful. I get to be here all of August. In an election year, we're not in session in October, because obviously we got the political part. But even September, 2 months before the election, we're in session for 2 weeks. Which is obviously makes it challenging, again, to do all 3 parts of that job that we talked about, any of which could be a full-time job when you are also commuting back and forth. And you have to be here in your district, hearing people, listening to them, representing them, but you also have to be in Washington 3/4 of the time to do the job. Or if you're not showing up for votes and you're missing them and you're back home listening all the time, your constituents are going to say, well, it's nice that you're here listening to me, but you're missing the votes on what you're hearing. And so sometimes we have a challenge. I'll give you an example. We had some floods here in Fort Collins and Boulder and Estes Park, as you know, last year. And so I made the decision, I'm going to stay in my district and miss what's going on in Washington that week, which had nothing to do with floods, because it is a crisis. They need us to be on the ground, working with FEMA, working with the National Guard, and that part of the job is much more important than, whatever we were voting on that week. Now, that's a judgment call, and constituents can agree or disagree, but if anybody says, why did you miss, why did you miss, 2 weeks of votes this year? Why did you have a, 92% attendance record instead of the other years where you had, 99? Well, I'll say, I think it was more important that during the flood, I was here working on that side of the job than voting on these unrelated measures for those 2 weeks. Likewise, had I gone to DC those 2 weeks, people would have said, why were you going to DC voting on those unrelated things when there were people dying and there were roads washed out and people stranded and you could have been here helping? And you have to be able to defend what you decide to do. You're an independent actor, you're an elected official, you have to make that decision. You just have to be able to defend whichever route you take. That one was an easy decision. I mean, of course I wasn't going to leave in the midst of a crisis and go, how could I even get my mind around voting on, whatever totally unrelated things we were talking about that week when we had such a crisis.
So kind of related, what happens if like DIA is shut down because of a winter storm or something, so you can't get out to DC the week you're supposed to be there?
We would miss votes. Again, if there was a countrywide storm that affected a lot of members coming back, they would probably delay it a day or two. I think that happened once, I recall, where just people couldn't get in and so they delayed it. But if it was just DIA and there were just the 7 of us that couldn't get back, Congress would go on without us. I would hope if there was anything important, the Democratic and Republican members from Colorado would call our leadership and say, you gotta delay it, we can't get back, we need to be here for that. But if it was something that was not important, meaning it was something that was non-controversial, that was fairly unanimous, Congress would go on without us. And again, I think that's happened once that I can recall where we just couldn't get there. And it's happened to other places too. There's places that, so in any given week, there could very well be several members, and there always are. They can't get, some might be sick, some might have a death in the family, some might have weather that they can't get in from, but that's normal. It's like school, right? 435 people on a given day, maybe 425, 415 show up. On a test day, really important day, right? Finals, you're going to probably get close to 435, maybe 434 if one is, dying or something, but you get all of them. But that's for finals, if there's a big bill. But on a regular day, our attendance might be, 415, just because people have lives. And if they're going to their parents' funeral or their, kid is sick or whatever it is, they just couldn't do it that week. So I want to hear, as part of the job, talking to the different parts, representing you, what issues would you like your member of Congress to work on? What's important to you? What ideas do you have for bills? What would you like to see me work on your behalf? Any ideas? Yes?
I saw on your website that you were pushing for immigration, how, it was a little confusing. So could you explain your platform on that?
Well, immigration reform is, I believe, very, very important for the country. We have about 10 million people here illegally. We don't have any real border security. We don't have workplace authentication, meaning very few employers really check, besides just getting a social security number and that number being valid, but there's no check that it's the right person using it or anything like that, which is why people are illegally employed. We have families that are being torn apart, so you have kids that are American and you have sometimes the mother or father or both being deported. So you have all kinds of problems, which don't solve themselves. Only Congress can act. If Congress doesn't solve it, we'll have all of these same problems and worse in 5 years or 10 years. They don't go away on their own. So therefore, Congress should act. So what should Congress do? We should fix immigration, which essentially means securing our border, making sure that employers across the country have an authentication of making sure that it's actually the person who has the permission to work. Make sure that people who are here and working and following our laws have the ability to do that legally as opposed to illegally. And that someday, if they play by the rules, learn English, do everything they should, in 15 years or 20 years, they can maybe become citizens someday too. And that would be their choice. There's some who want to work here for 5 or 10 years and then move to another country back, and we need them in farms and everywhere else too. So that's a different thing. We need to have the route for doing that. But some, just like, unless any of you are 100% Native American, your ancestors came from somewhere. Mine came from Eastern Europe, Poland, Ukraine, Russia. around the year 1905, and so there are families like that today that want to come here and have their kids and grandkids and great-grandkids here as Americans. And so this country has always been a nation of immigrants and a nation of laws, and we need to reconcile those two through immigration reform.
So along with that, you were talking about securing our borders. Is that mainly just a financial issue, just how expensive it is, that's why people are trying to figure out different ways?
Yeah, it is expensive, and it's also important to point out that that's only about half of the cause of illegal immigration. So about half the immigrants who are here illegally cross the border illegally. The other half that are here illegally cross the border legally, which means they came as tourists or as students or the variety of ways that you can come here, and they stayed illegally and worked illegally. So they are here illegally, just as people who cross the border came illegally. So even if you had, and you never, 100%, but you see theoretically 100% border security. Nobody could sneak in across the northern border or southern border. Now that's not going to happen. We want to get to whatever 99%, but just imagine you had 100% on north and south. You still would have half of the people that are here illegally you still have half the problem basically, because people can just come here legally and then stay illegally and work. So you still have to address the other sides. But the border security piece is important because it is half of the problem. And yes, it is a financial issue. And the Senate Immigration Reform Bill, which I certainly support, and it passed the Senate with more than 2/3 majority, spends $40 billion on border security. Now, I don't know what the dollar amount is. That's not my area of expertise. There's two pieces to it. What is the dollar amount, and then how do you deploy that money? Can you do it for 20? Does it take 60? Whatever it takes, the money should come from within immigration reform itself, because part of what we do in immigration reform is it actually raises money. If you were here illegally, you have to pay a fine. And so part of that fine is going to go towards border security. Part of it will go towards the whole processing of the whole system and the registration, but it doesn't come from other taxpayers. It just comes from the penalties and fees that people have to pay who are violating our laws. But yes, it takes money. I'm not an expert enough to know if you can secure the border for, $5 billion or $40 billion or $100 billion. It's doable. It involves technology, not just what we think of as kind of like a literal brick wall. It involves monitoring and satellites and drones and all of that, and people, of course. And President Obama has increased the number of folks involved with border security with kind of a border surge, but they haven't had the money on the infrastructure side. So while that has decreased the crossings, and we have a lot more people down there, it clearly takes more than people. I mean, you can't possibly just with people do that. You do need the infrastructure piece as well. Another piece of border security needs to be enhancing the legitimate flow of goods and people across the border. Our southern border is very important for commerce, very important for trade. We have NAFTA. We have free trade with Mexico. Mexico is Colorado's #1 trading partner. It fluctuates between number 2 and 3 for our entire country. Those top trading partners of our country are Canada, Mexico, and China. They're 1, 2, and 3. All of them are very important, as we all know. There are a lot more geopolitical complexities with China being one of our top trading partners, and there's a number of reasons that we would want to, as policymakers, foster trade with Canada and Mexico. There's a lot less geopolitical problems than there would be with the more complex relationship we have with China, who's not always an ally on the world stage. So we want to facilitate the flow of legitimate goods and services and people across that southern border, meaning we have a lot of flow of things back and forth. We want to have high-tech ways of x-raying trucks so that it's quick, rather than just having to have dogs go in and sniff everyone or people look at everything, making sure there's no contraband, drugs, anything illegal. But when there's televisions going back and forth, clothing going back and forth, that should be as quick and as efficient as possible. And then people. We have, of course, tourism both ways, and I represent the district that has Vail and Beaver Creek in that area, and there are a lot of Mexican tourists, wealthy Mexican families that spend their time and money there, and we rely on that for our economy in those areas. And of course, border areas like San Diego and El Paso have a lot of people going both ways every day for work. You have people living on either side that literally commute across the border, legally, of course. And that needs to be quick because it's an economic efficiency. If it takes them an hour and a half to commute versus 20 minutes to commute, that detracts from overall economic efficiency. So at the same time, we want to keep out contraband goods and people who don't have permission to cross. We want to facilitate the ability of people who do have permission to cross and legitimate commerce. What else would you like to see Congress working on for you? Yes?
Well, I guess like simplifying like welfare and social security and Obamacare and Medicare. Like, why don't we just kind of try to simplify it and put it under one program?
Which one? Social Security, Medicare, and Obamacare. I'll put them all under one. Well, they're all very different, right? So, and frankly, the administration